It is a joy to welcome you to the last roundtable of our 2021 Summer Institute for Reconciliation. This is the last roundtable, but not the last session. Remember that after finishing this session, we will have our closing plenary at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. My name is Nina Balmaceda. I serve as Associate Director of the Center for Reconciliation, and I am honored to host this roundtable to dialogue and learn together about Pope Francis' encyclical letter, Frattelli Tutti, which means we are all brothers and sisters. And this encyclical is about fraternity and social friendship. In a previous encyclical letter, Laudato Si, in 2015, Pope Francis encouraged us to seriously consider our responsibility toward our common home, our planet, and to defend it from abuse, and to also defend people who are most vulnerable to suffer injustice and the effects of climate degradation. In Frattelli Tutti, Pope Francis also invites us to consider most relevant issues, some of which can be quite controversial. He submits particular positions that are in conflict with today's prevailing conceptions about work, the market, globalization. Moreover, he addresses not only economic issues, but also very relevant ideas in the social and political arenas. When he addresses issues related to common good, fraternity, and social friendship, or solidarity, as we are more used to say in Latin America. Different people will have different points of view about each of these topics, but something we at the Center for Reconciliation are very thankful for is that Pope Francis, by issuing this encyclical letter, has invited us, believers and non-believers, to reflect together about fraternity and sorority and solidarity. Pope Francis invites us to participate in a public global dialogue about some of the most fundamental issues related to human community. Moreover, this invitation is not only for members of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, but for everyone. And to help us understand better this text and its teachings, and encourage us to consider its various implications in practical life from a global perspective, I am so deeply honored to introduce in alphabetical order our distinguished panelists and dear friends of our center. For now, I will just mention their names and I will be introducing each one as they speak to us. Jackson Adamah from Ghana, Peter Casarella from the United States, Yuko Fukushima from Japan, Lucie Martinot-Lagarde from France, Bishop Juan de Dios Peña from El Salvador, and Wojciech Szczerba from Poland. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Casarella from the United States. Dr. Casarella is a professor at Duke Divinity School with expertise in Latinx theology and pneumatology. His recent books include The Whole is Greater Than Its Parts, Ecumenism and Interreligious Encounters in the Age of Pope Francis, published in 2020. And with Maria Clara Bingamer, Pope Francis and the Search for God in America, the significance of the early visits of Pope Francis to the Americas, published in 2021. Welcome, Dr. Casarella.
Thank you, Nina. Buenos dias, bonjour, buongiorno, good morning, good evening. Hello to everyone. I thought I'd get the dialogue started by saying just a word about the Argentine and Latin American context for Frattelli Tutti. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, today known as Pope Francis, in the 1970s, of course, experienced the Argentine Dirty War and the massacre of priests. And perhaps even more noteworthy is that he was accused of not protecting his fellow Jesuits when he in his 30s was just a young provincial, and that was a very scarring experience. But the problem of social unrest, the problem of polarization in society was very palpable and affected him in this young age. But let me jump ahead to his period as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And particularly in 2006, he annually gave a Te Deum homily. And as Thomas Rourke and others have noted, the Te Deum homilies were his speaking truth to power, so much so that the then president, Nestor Kirchner, anointed Bergoglio, Archbishop Bergoglio, the leader of the opposition. Let me just read you two brief citations from his Te Deum homily of May 25th, 2006. He spoke, for example, of la alegría que solo experimentamos cuando tenemos alma de pobres, the joy that we have only when we have the soul of the poor. And of course, his point of departure is blessed are the poor, the Beatitudes. Or la fuerza transformadora de amistad social. The social friendship that he talks about in Frattelli was already preached by Archbishop Bergoglio, trying to argue for transparency and social justice on the part of the regime. It was a very conflictual relationship. Bergoglio was never a revolutionary, but he was always prophetic in this regard. Now, jumping ahead to 2007, some of you already know about CELAM, the Council of Latin American Bishops' Conferences, which had very important meetings in 68 and 79. But in 2007, the General Conference of CELAM took place in Brazil in Aparecida, and two strands of Latin American theology came together. One was the theology of liberation that had defended the preferential option for the poor. But remember, in 2007, Pope Benedict comes to Aparecida to preside at that meeting. Bergoglio, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, is chair of the drafting committee for the final document. And many people who've studied this carefully have noted that the final document of Aparecida is the first draft of the pontificate of Pope Francis. And so what do you find there? Los rostros sufrientes de los pobres son los rostros sufrientes de Cristo. The suffering visages, the suffering faces of the poor are the suffering faces of Christ. So two things come together here. The Latin American tradition of preferential option for the poor with Christocentrism, that we don't engage with the poor without encountering the person of Christ, and vice versa. Finally, I want to mention March 2013 at the conclave in which Bergoglio was elected Pope. The conversation that took place with the Brazilian Cardinal Hummus, sitting right next to him during the conclave. Hummus says, "Don't forget the poor." Bergoglio knew he was about to be elected. Pondering that remark, decided on the name of Francis, not the Jesuit Francis Xavier, but Saint Francis of Assisi. Why? He says, Francis was the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. Well, that just takes us to the first paragraphs of Frattelli Tutti, in which it's recalled, as was developed at great length in Laudato Si, that Francis evoked brother, that he was brother to the sun, sea, and wind. So the earth is our common home. But Francis also was the poor follower of Christ who went to meet the Sultan in the time of the Crusades, Frattelli Tutti number 3. And that recalls Pope Francis's meeting in 2019 with the Grand Imam, Ahmad al-Tayeb, the great Sunni scholar, in which they co-authored a document on human fraternity, which is, of course, cited and developed in Frattelli Tutti, to show that across at least the monotheistic religions and beyond, there's a recognition that's absolutely crucial for global peace today of the transcendent value and dignity of the human person. And just one last word on fraternidad. What in the lexicon of Bergoglio, Francis, and Latin American theology is distinctive? I just want to say that many things, the relationship to belonging to a people is very important in Frattelli Tutti and in general in the thought of Pope Francis. But the fact that fraternidad, or as Dr. Balmaceda said, sometimes we use the term interchangeably with solidaridad, is ontological. It's a basic relation that we find pre-existing when we think about our relationship to our neighbor. It's not a voluntary associationism that we create but it's something that's pre-existing and has to be unearthed from our existing social relations. Well, I could go on, but thank you for giving me this opportunity to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casarella, for that excellent introduction to help us understand who Pope Francis is and where these ideas come from. I am now going to introduce a dear friend as well, Dr. Wojciech Szczerba, who is from Poland. Dr. Szczerba is the rector-president of the Evangelical School of Theology in Poland. He also serves as the rector-in-chief of the periodical Theologica Vratislaviensia, and he is involved in various ecumenical initiatives and interreligious dialogue. Dr. Szczerba has written 2 books dealing with the issue of universal salvation in Greek philosophy and early Christian thought. Welcome, Wojciech.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be able to share my thoughts about Frattelli Tutti. And yeah, I come from Poland, from a very Catholic country, a country of John Paul II. And I remember really reading the encyclicals of John Paul II and really his ideas or looking at him as some kind of political, social activist, when he was really sure about his mission from God and that he wanted to introduce the Christianity or the church into the 3rd millennium. And Laborem Exercens or Evangelium Vitae or Fides et Ratio. And then there was Benedict XVI, the Pope theologian, and his deep theological, philosophical treatises. There was Caritas Specialpi, Caritas in Veritate, and it was amazing really to read this philosophical or theological deep works. So I remember really starting reading the encyclicals and documents of Francis, Pope Francis. And then I realized that he is a pastor, that he is not really speaking, he's not really introducing these deep ideas, or maybe he is, but in the form of a language of a common person, an everyday experience. And there is lots of passion and there is lots of charisma. And it was, I have to say, it was not easy to read his encyclicals. Maybe the first one was easy, Lumen Fidei, as it was still written by Benedict XVI, but then Laudato Si and Frattelli Tutti. Well, Frattelli Tutti, my first idea or the impression when I read this encyclical was, what is this? I thought, well, I'm somewhere between early Marx, The Little Prince, Martin Luther King, and my 10-year-old son. So I thought, okay, what to do with that? And then I realized that this is a dream, really, a beautiful dream, really, when he is talking, we are all brothers. And he's talking about this simple Christ-like teaching that we should love everybody. And then there is this question, who is my neighbor? Who's my brother or sister? And then he's answering everybody, every person, no matter what is the origin of this person, religion, status, gender, or sexual orientation. He is somehow leading us into, open fraternity, open brotherhood. And yes, he's referring to Francis of Assisi and his admonitions. And he is not really giving some kind of prescription, but I think he's sharing this vision or this program or this dream or this sermon maybe. I think this is a utopian literature that is wonderful really, when he is just showing the direction in which he believes the church or Christians or humanity should go, with this idea that when one person has a dream, he or she just stays with his dream. But when everybody has a dream, then we can change the reality. So, well, he's just sharing this dream and talking about the open to the world. He's criticizing the world. And I think something like 20% of the encyclical is really the criticism of today's world. But then he's also talking about Good Samaritan. And this is crucial, really, to see really somebody who is a stranger, potentially enemy, infidel, apostate, enemy, who is closer to God than the Levite or the priest. Is a kind of paradoxical. But this Samaritan, this enemy, this infidel, gives some kind of example how we could act in today's world that is not easy and that is quite perplexed. And he believes that this common humanity, this communion that we can build can be somehow based on solidarity and selflessness that refers to every person, and it grows beyond the egotism that is me before thou, or that is somehow experienced by lust or something like that. And I'm thinking of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was born in my town, and he's talking about that, we should act as if we were Christ to another person, no matter who he or she is, but also we should see Christ in the face of another person. And there's also this word by Levinas and Elie Wiesel from Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is about 2 hours drive from this very place. And they were asked, where was God in Auschwitz? And then Elie Wiesel said, I saw God in the face of another prisoner. And Levinas answered, God died on the gallows of Auschwitz. And I think there are deep truths into it. They somehow refer to this dream and the fear somehow also of Pope Francis. But then there is a big question to me also how to refer the teaching of Pope Francis to the institutional church. And I think that this dream, at least from my Polish perspective, somehow goes beyond the institution. And there is this illustration of Francis of Assisi before he dies. He goes to the church and he takes off his clothes and he lies down naked before God. And when I'm reading the encyclical, this is how I see Pope Francis somehow, that he's opening his heart before the humanity, or maybe that he's standing before God, almost naked. And then he's looking at God and he's trying to translate what he sees to us. And maybe this is naive, but I think it's also beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wojciech. So inspiring. And your presentation already provoked like 10 questions, but we'll see how time allows us. And now I am delighted to also introduce to you Ms. Lucie Martinot-Lagarde from France. Lucie has been since 2011 a committed member of the Chemin Neuf community, an international Roman Catholic community with an ecumenical vocation and a focus on reconciliation and unity. She is currently pursuing a master's degree in conflict transformation at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University in Virginia. Bienvenue, Lucie.
Merci beaucoup. Hi, everyone. Very nice to be here today. So, as you said, Nina, I'm currently a student in peace building, and I think Frattelli Tutti can be read as a handbook for peace building practitioners, because we are dreamers, like Dr. Szczerba just said. This encyclical is for dreamers. So it's perfect for us, dreamers and practitioners. And in 2017, Francis wrote an annual message for the World Day of Peace, and it was entitled "Non-Violence, a Style of Politics for Peace." And in this text, he called for peace building through active non-violence. So then comes Frattelli Tutti, and the word non-violence itself doesn't appear in the encyclical. However, as Dr. Szczerba just said, the Pope names Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, and Mahatma Gandhi as one of the main people who inspired the text. So I will just want a few words about how this encyclical gives a kind of framework for just peace a vision and attitude to build peace with justice. So one thing that I found particularly insightful, and we will dive a little bit in the text, is that the Pope names the tension that arises when it comes to forgiveness and reconciliation. And I'll try to share my screen. Up. Yes. So the Pope writes, there are those who prefer not to talk of reconciliation, for they think that conflict, violence, and breakdown are part of the normal functioning of a society. Second reason, other things that promoting forgiveness means yielding a ground and influence to others. For this reason, they feel it's better to keep things as they are, maintaining a balance of power between different groups. Still others believe that reconciliation is a sign of weakness. Incapable of truly serious dialogue, they choose to avoid problems by ignoring injustice and looking for apparent peace. So the Pope names this tension, and I think it's very important because it's true, forgiveness implies a form of vulnerability, and reconciliation implies a form of letting go. And there is the risk of reinforcing existing power imbalances or losing ground in a strategy to build power to bring justice. So this is very strong today in the peace-building academia. For example, here in the US, where I'm studying now, to refuse a weak reconciliation or a dialogue that is just superficial and doesn't address real injustices. Because time is for strategy, time is for justice. For example, between Christian political obediences or in interracial issues. And so do we throw away reconciliation then? What do we do with that? And the Pope reframes this notion in a way that's interesting for me. I will share another paragraph. I hope you can see it. The Pope wrote, we are called to love everyone without exception. At the same time, loving an oppressor does not mean allowing him to keep oppressing us or that what he does is acceptable. On the contrary, true love for an oppressor means seeking ways to make him cease his oppression. It means stripping him of power that he does not know how to use and that diminishes his own humanity and that of others. And I think it is really good and healthy that the Pope would name that and say enemy love is not about being weak and nice. Enemy love is active. Enemy love is transformational. And it's really like giving moral ground for very pragmatic, nonviolent actions, for example. So if forgiveness is not about surrendering your power of resistance and your power of action, then why is it important? And the Pope says it's because of anger, because anger and desire of revenge is unhealthy, is destructive for yourself and then for the soul of your people. So he doesn't say that you have to forgive, and he says you can and you don't have to. But when you do choose this, you choose not to use the same destructive forces and you choose to break the vicious circle. So there is a form of power, like forgiveness being a source of power, because it enables us to pursue justice without falling into the spiral of revenge and without falling in the injustice of forgetting. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. So I think this is a very important, interesting point to bring into dialogue with the field of peace building today, because there can be so many misinterpretations about the call to forgiveness, and especially in the Catholic Church or maybe other churches. When we look at how forgiveness was used to be like a solution for clergy abuse, forgiveness that is forgetting, letting go simply. And so yeah, highlighting the power of this spiritual and personal and gracious free act of forgiveness. This section, this paragraph of Frattelli Tutti says also that power analysis are important, but they are not the only possible lens when it comes to transformative social action. So yeah, this is one insight that I wanted to share with you, and there are so many. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucie. And we'll definitely come back to this issue because I do agree this is a key point of the many points that Pope Francis makes about how important it is to pay attention to power dynamics, but to also resist the oppressor and resist our own inclinations for hating others, our inclinations to fear. And forgiveness, I have found, is a powerful remedy against fear. In fact, let me mention, since we will be listening from Jackson in a second, but I just wanted to share with all of you, and since I'm seeing some of my colleagues from the Americas Initiative, that as we were considering the name for our Initiative for Reconciliation, we took this call, what Lucie has addressed very seriously. And that's why our initiative is called the Americas Initiative for Transformation and Reconciliation. So maybe that may come up in the questions later. Before introducing our next speaker, I want to once again welcome everyone, especially those that just joined us, and inform you that the chat is open now. If you would like to start sharing your comments and especially your questions to our panelists, please go ahead. We do not have translation today, so please do your best to leave your questions and comments in English. If you prefer to write in Spanish, I will be able to read your questions and translate them. But if you speak a different language, we do appreciate if you try to share your questions in English. Mr. Jackson Adamah is from Ghana. He's a second-year Doctor of Theology student specializing in theology and ethics at Duke University Divinity School. His research engages eco-theology, political theology, and missiology in Africa. He is a fellow at the Center for Reconciliation, and we are so grateful to have him as a good friend of our center. Welcome, Jackson.
Thank you. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be with you on this pilgrimage. For starters, I think that the Frattelli Tutti, Pope Francis's encyclical, the dialogue and friendship in society that he calls for, to my mind, is really built on the conception of humanity that we see developed in the encyclical. Yes, although it's not philosophically heavy, we still see traces and bits and pieces here and there of who the human is, like portrait of who the human is scattered through the encyclical. And I want to flag paragraph 87, where he says, human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others, nor can they fully know themselves apart from an encounter with other persons. I communicate effectively with myself only insofar as I communicate with others. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. And this statement right here, to my mind, resonates with the Southern African philosophical concept of Ubuntu in many, many significant ways. Ubuntu has many iterations, but it is more commonly summed up as I am because you are, we are because you are. And this ubiquitous saying underscores the fact that humans become persons through relations of gift and reciprocity with others. To put it differently, Ubuntu philosophy designates the human person as the product of a community. Like Frattelli Tutti, Ubuntu pushes against the individualistic and competitive conceptions of humanity in Western philosophical discourse. Now, as evidenced in the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by Desmond Tutu, the most widely recognized proponent of Ubuntu as a praxis for reconciliation, The philosophy informs reconciliatory practices that restore the humanity of both the oppressed and the oppressor. Furthermore, Ubuntu engenders the idea that personhood is a never-ending process that can only be nourished in community with other persons. And I see this, this idea littered through many places in the encyclical, and time will not permit me to read some of these sections. According to one African philosopher by name James Ogude, although the process of becoming a person begins with one's closest community, that is the family, it is the condition that drives the development of personhood in a universal community of persons, of humans. Thus, although very much a local philosophical concept, Ubuntu can serve as a universal ethical and moral concept for reordering communities beyond the confines of South Africa and Africa at large. And again, drawing on this same philosopher Ogude, Ubuntu conception of humanity upholds the symbiotic relationship between the individual and the community. And this I see in Frattelli Tutti. He does, although he's talking about fraternity, universal fraternity, he pays particular attention to also local forms of life, local communities. And so you find this healthy tension between the universal and the local, particularity and Catholicity, which I find to be very, very helpful. And I see that encapsulated in this idea of Ubuntu. And so, yeah, I will just end here and come in later, but it's a very brilliant encyclical to my mind, and I'm really pleased to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much. And we are pleased that you are with us, helping us understand more deeply the content of this great document, as several of you have already acknowledged, a document that it has been written for the common person. Next, it is a joy to introduce Dr. Yuko Fukushima from Japan. Dr. Fukushima is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ in Japan and professor at Yamaguchi-Queen, apologies for my very poor pronunciation, University of Tokyo, where she serves as a university chaplain. Her book, Telling Stories of Women in the Scriptures, was published in Japanese in 2020. She has been a council member of our regional partner initiative, the Northeast Asian Christian Forum for Reconciliation, since 2012. Welcome, Dr. Fukushima.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you. And then I read Frattelli Tutti with excitement. It is such a beautiful book to read. And then I thought Pope Francis visited Japan 2019, and then he visited Nagasaki, Hiroshima, Fukushima, 3 regions, and of course Tokyo. And I'm surprised that Pope Francis talks about Nagasaki just a little bit. It's a paragraph 248, the page 113. So I thought I may introduce a little bit about the history of Nagasaki Christians. So let me share the slide with you. This is the short history of Nagasaki. It goes back to the old time. In 1549, Catholic missionary came to Japan. This is the first time. And then in 1613, Christianity was banned in Japan. This was the beginning of the hidden Christians. For 250 years, the hidden Christians kept their faith without priests. They handed over their faith to the next generations using the precise ecclesiastical calendar and faith confession in oral. In 1865, the hidden Christians in Nagasaki village, Urakami village, suddenly revealed their religious identity and started to openly go to the church, which was built by French missionaries. After 3 years, the final and severest persecution started at Urakami village. Almost 3,000 Christians were displaced to the other parts of Japan. They call it journey. In this journey, 1,000 Christians died by torture, hard labor, and bad nutrition. In 1873, the ban to Christianity was lifted by the pressure from the Western countries. Right after coming back to Urakami village, Christians created a mountain of the cross. It is located at a hillside. They walked up the mountain of the cross by praying the forgiveness of those who persecuted them. It is surprising. Also, Urakami Christians prayed for those who died by persecution and those who could not endure the persecution, meaning they betrayed Christianity, but that these Christians prayed for them too. In 30 years, the Urakami Christians built the beautiful and biggest chapel in Asia with their own money. They are very poor people, but they finally built a chapel. Eventually, that chapel came to be a cathedral. This is the picture of that cathedral. However, in 1945, August 9, the nuclear atomic bomb was dropped almost on the top of the Urakami Cathedral. So 8,000 to 10,000 of 15,000 church members were killed instantly. The survivors of Urakami Christians were annoyed by those who said that God did not protect his own people. Also, still now, the second and the third generations of the survivors have been physically suffering from the nuclear radioactivity. At that time, an influential Christian doctor, Nagai Takashi in Urakami, tried to encourage his church members by saying that Urakami Christian suffering by the atomic bomb was necessary as a burnt offering to God. Dr. Nagai emphasized forgiveness. This forgiveness is the only way to keep Christian faith for these Urakami people. We need to see that Dr. Nagai is talking to his fellow Christians at Urakami. This faith community have 400 years of history in which they received severe persecutions many times, but survived with prayers for forgiveness to others and to themselves. However, from another perspective, in 1945, the atomic bomb killed the hundreds or probably more than 1,000 of the Chinese, Koreans, and Dutch victims. The Chinese and Koreans in Nagasaki were abducted by the Japanese army with the order of Japanese government for cheap labor at the area. Nagasaki has a famous spot for building battleships. The Dutch people were the prisoners of war. Their life conditions were extremely abusive. They died and suffered at the atomic bomb too. The atomic bomb at Nagasaki afflicted multiple people who have their own histories. In this globalized world, I mean, this is kind of the summary, even we are not aware of it, we afflict others and we are afflicted by others and we observe the affliction. But I think Pope Francis really wants to stop the war. The atomic bomb is a kind of symbol of the war. We should not use the atomic weapons at all. So they end the, this is the end, sorry. So I really moved this part of saying, he is saying in the page 114, we need to keep alive the flame of collective conscience bearing witness to succeeding generations to the honor of what happened, because that witness awakens and preserves the memory of the victims, so that the conscience of humanity may rise up in the face of every desire for dominance and destruction. So I think the Pope Francis book sounds unrealistic, but it is really realistic for keeping peace and stopping war. That is my comment. Thank you.
Arigato, Dr. Fukushima. Very, very provoking, relevant comments. I appreciate your contribution, and I'm sure there will be questions that will be coming your way as well. Next, I am going to introduce Bishop Juan de Dios Peña from El Salvador. Bishop Juan de Dios is the resident bishop of the Evangelical Methodist Church of El Salvador and the president of the College of Bishops of the Council of Evangelical Methodist Churches in Latin America and the Caribbean. He is also a dear friend of the Center for Reconciliation, and I am honored to also consider him a good personal friend. Bienvenido, Obispo Juan de Dios.
Thank you so much, Nina. And thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to reflect around the cyclical Frattelli Tutti, especially that it was given to us in one of the most challenging times that this world is crossing to. As this pandemic is not over, there is a huge difference from a country to another one in terms of access to healthcare, economical assistance, social distancing, vaccines, and of course, the quality of the vaccines for every region, just to mention some of the difficulties. But also during the last few days, we have been witness to the political, economical, social, and military crisis in different places around the world, happening at the same time, like the crisis in Colombia, the bellic situation between Palestinians and Israelis, taking the life of several children. So many things that happens, like we as human beings have not learned anything from the mistakes made in the past. We as the church, very often silent. If it doesn't affect us directly, if it does, we become the voice of the ones crying in the wilderness. What affects us in El Salvador, it should affect the ones that live in the US and around the world. If affects the ones in Colombia, it should affect us in El Salvador, or at least to stand in solidarity. Frattelli Tutti invite us to live in solidarity with one another, to interact, to be present, as our Bishop Romero, Saint Romero said, to feel with the church. But we are not limited to feel only with the church, but also we are called to feel with the global village that include to all of us, to all people from all nations, religions, or not religions, ethnics, tongues, economical conditions, etc. The new generations are in danger. Actually, Pope Francis, he specifically speaks about how the youth are in danger as the world is full of fake news or news that sells our lives and makes public what is private, and it makes private what it needs to be known by everyone. It needs to be managed publicly. As a Salvadorian bishop living in Central America, it makes me feel sad to see all people that abandon their countries because what needs to be for everyone is available just for a few people. To see that the roots of poverty, violence, and death are still the same ones that Saint Romero preaches against them are not gone, still there. That corruption makes those problems even greater. It is sad because many people died trying to cross countries and borders. And in the recent history from the pandemic that we face right now, does not matter where and when but it happens. And once in a while, the history of one or two of thousands, it becomes known by everyone. Like the history of the father and the daughter, Oscar and Valeria, that trying to cross Rio Bravo were found face down water of the Mexico side of the river. Or most recently, Victoria Salazar, that escaping from the violence in El Salvador, of course, from the bad guys here, it was murdered by the good guys, but the good boys in Tulum, Mexico, living there legally, being protected by the Higher Commissioner for Refugees of the United Nations. Both histories were published in the news around the globe that present the reality of so many others here in El Salvador and beyond. It is sad that those people have to die to show that the problems in our countries are real. When Pope Francis speaks through the encyclical, I feel that he was talking about my own country, my own context, my own people. That tells me that all that tells me that the reality that the world lives is global. It's a global thing. It's a global challenge with no borders, with no walls, because those situations cross with no rules, with no passports. Jesus put a special emphasis on migrants, orphans, children, and widows. Oscar, Valeria, Victoria, all of them migrants. Victoria's daughter became orphan. Valeria is a child. Oscar's wife that stays in El Salvador now is a widow. All of them needed a good Samaritan to protect them, to love them, to clear their wounds, to feed them, someone to stop and help them in their way to Samaria, on their way to the American dream. Of course, to migrate is a right. To move around the globe, it should be a right. But also, to stay, it should be a personal decision and an individual right. In our communities, we're in front of great chance to walk away from the people in need or to be with our neighbors as good Samaritans. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources, it takes patience. It takes us out of our comfort zone. It takes us out of ourselves. It may take your own life, as Romero offered his life for his neighbors, like Jesus did, of course. We decide if we want to be involved or not, if we want to walk by or walk in or walk with. Not only because we want to express our solidarity, but because we can love as Jesus loved us. We're not the only ones called to do this work. It takes other actors. We cannot monopolize those tasks. We are small seeds or farmers planting small seeds of hope in this world. It's not enough to pray, but as Pope Francis says, he encourages us to embrace them, to protect them, to promote them, and to integrate them. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Obispo. Thank you very much. So now, before we go to next round of questions, I want to acknowledge Kenitra's comment on the chat, as I am also encouraging everyone to please share your thoughts and especially your questions on the chat. Kenitra writes, I appreciate what presenters, especially Lucie, have lifted. This makes me think of protests differently. You love yourself, your community, perhaps even your country enough to risk calling it to be greater, to not stop dreaming that something more, something better is possible, and believing that oppressors can act differently. If I may say that oppressors can experience transformation and also those who are suffering violence can experience transformation. Thank you, Kenitra, and thank you everyone once again for joining us today. We are discussing the great papal letter of Frattelli Tutti, and I just wanted to mention something, maybe because I am Latin American, I cannot remain silent on this one, as much as I appreciate the great contribution of different truth commissions around the world. I would like to just call attention to everyone that the first Truth Commission was the Truth Commission of Argentina, which was put together in 1984, right after the military dictatorship, precisely the terrible military dictatorship where Bergoglio was a local priest, and he had to walk a very fine line of what some people have described as collaboration with the regime, and others have described as very strategic dialogue in order to save lives. So the Truth Commission of Argentina issued the first report of a Truth Commission called Nunca Más, Never Again. And as they described the horrendous crimes that the military regime in Argentina had carried out, they also demanded guarantees of non-repetition. And I think that has to be part of our conversation. We acknowledge the horrendous evil, the violence, the imbalance in power, the accumulation of wealth, while so many people lack the basics. Yuko has invited us to consider very seriously the implications of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that we should never allow that to happen again. And if you follow the peace process in Colombia, that is one of the biggest challenges as well. Part of the conversation in the peace process is how to secure and assure guarantees of non-repetition. So with that, we are going to move on to the next round of questions, and I would like to invite Dr. Szczerba to address the issue of power and hierarchy in post-communist Central Europe and what we can learn from Frattelli Tutti in this regard.
Thank you very much. I think this is wonderful. This conversation is really deep and thought-provoking and very optimistic. And I hope I will not sound too pessimistic now. I'll try not to. Okay, but I'm wondering about this encyclical. It's beautiful. And I'm wondering about the Pope as a person. And I really admire him and his dream and his ideas. But then I also think that he is the head of the Catholic Church. And then I think, well, in my context, the Catholic Church is a interesting institution, really. It has been involved in my country and in Central Europe, but let me focus now on my country. Since the 10th century, this was the moment when Poland was baptized or christened, and it became a Christian country. And the Catholic Church grew really strong in Poland. Right now, something like 93 to 95% of people admit that they are Catholic. Something like of almost 50-55% go every Sunday to the church. If there are good churches, like there is one Dominican church nearby, you have to be an hour in advance to get to the church, which is really wonderful. But the church is a huge power in Poland. It's an important player, not only in terms of spirituality, but also in terms of, well, economic, political, social perspective. And at times, it can be somehow egocentric. So for centuries, the church acquired lots of properties, lots of power. It fought rather effectively the competition of different kinds. And it became really nationalistic, especially in 19th century. This is the time when Poland disappeared for 123 years, because part was taken by Germany, part was taken by Russia. So this was the time when Poland and Czech Republic and other countries became kind of Catholic, because Catholicism was somehow chosen against Lutheran Germany and Eastern Orthodox Russia. So the church became nationalistic, and it stayed this way. It somehow got stronger during the communist times, at least in Poland, as a kind of opposition to communists. And after the fall of communism in 1989, well, one of the issues that really made the church stronger was the Pope, John Paul II. And the second thing was this capitalism that came to Poland was really kind of aggressive capitalism. And the church somehow fought against this type of capitalism. But now we are experiencing the first wave, this really, really important or serious wave of secularism in Poland. And there are various issues that somehow, well, that somehow make it happening. So, well, first of all, there are younger generations growing up for whom the church is not longer, they do not remember the communist times, and they do not somehow associate the church with fighting the communism. Then the teaching of the Catholic Church, it seems to be very conservative, and it doesn't reflect the issues in Poland, doesn't reflect the issues that people are really coping with. And there are lots of problems also in that refer to the Catholic Church in Poland. So let me just mention a few. Okay, so there is the issue of cooperation with regime, with the Catholic regime. Now it turns out that well, the leaders of the Catholic Church, many of them really cooperated with the regime. Then there is this huge wealth that is accumulated in the Catholic Church in Poland and generally Central Europe. And then there are also these moral sexual scandals that make this whole situation uneasy, which really make especially young people to leave the Catholic Church. So, okay, so from this perspective, I'm reading this encyclical, and I think it's really beautiful, and it's difficult not to stop and to think or to cry even when reading this encyclical. But there is a big question behind how much it really reflects the personal dream of the Pope, which I believe it's so beautiful, and how much it really reflects the church as an institution who is an institution of power. And quite often, at least in my context, it is an oppressive institution of power. When it opposes women, we had lots of protests lately. When it opposes vaccination for some reasons, and when it opposes migrations, they support the Polish government, which says no migrants whatsoever from Northern Africa and the Middle East. So again, I'm wondering how much really it reflects, on the one hand, the teaching of the Pope, and on the other hand, I'm wondering how much this beautiful encyclical can change the church. But on the other hand, I'm asking myself, has any of the encyclicals really changed the church? I'm not sure. So there is this kind of big division, and within me, some kind of paradox that I really love what the Pope says. And on the other hand, I'm hearing this kind of memento mori. And actually what comes to my mind, I'm sorry, I need to add that, is this illustration from Nietzsche, from Joyful Wisdom, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when there is this madman who goes to the market and he's looking for God. But the people are laughing at him, but they are unbelievers. So they do not believe in God, and there is no God in their world. So he's disappointed and he goes to the churches and he's going to sing Requiem for God, which is sign of honoring the God. But he's let out of the churches and he realizes that the churches are no more than the graves of the dead God. So he actually, well, there is this metaphor really touching, that there is nothing else than the corpse, the decomposing corpse of God in the churches. So there is this horrible stench of this dying God, and the God built of fear and unjust social condition is dead. And this is what he is announcing. But the irony is that in Nietzsche, that the believers, they do not realize that this type of God, the God built of fear and unjust social conditions, is dead. So they try to resuscitate this old anachronistic God, and many still believe that such a God is alive, but this God is dead. So when I'm reading this encyclical, I'm crying, and I love this idea, but there is this Nietzsche that is somehow whispering to my ear, memento mori. So this is it.
Thank you, Wojciech. Maybe two quick reflections on this one, on this great contribution that you make. Last night, we had invited and we were blessed by the presence of the leaders of our regional initiatives in last night's roundtable. And one of our participants from Latin America was wrestling with this, of how much the church, whatever church tradition we're talking about, in Christian history has been characterized by being a servant to reconciliation and to love neighbor, and precisely your point. And as we were dialoguing, because that's all that we are trying to do here, just coming together and dialogue and learn from one another, respect ourselves in our differences. But in our conversation, what we were coming to realize is that there is always this minority who follows the prophetic, the spirit of being prophetic, in the outcry, the protest against this, what we might describe in some cases as dead religion versus the life of Christ, moving us and getting us out of our comfort zone and our safety and moving us to risk everything. And I wonder, many times I have wondered regarding Frattelli Tutti and Laudato Si and in the other very important letters written by Pope Francis and his team, is this is a mark of how brave he is, how courageous he is, because it will not be without consequence. Positive, but also a lot of risk for them. I would like to move us along now, and I would like to invite Dr. Casarella to please help us consider the following question. How does Pope Francis in Frattelli Tutti invites us to achieve an equilibrium between the wisdom of particular local cultures, beliefs, idioms, versus the massification of what we may call probably a global values? Actually, I would describe them more as Western values that are imposed through globalization. Would love to hear your thoughts about how to understand this concept of equilibrium, but also any practical recommendations you may have for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. I'll explain the slide in a minute, but I want to begin by recalling the words from Frattelli 142. We need to have a global outlook to save ourselves from petty provincialism. When our house stops being a home and starts to become an enclosure, a cell, then the global comes to our rescue, like a final cause that draws us toward our fulfillment. At the same time, though, the local has to be eagerly embraced, for it possesses something that the global does not. It is capable of being a leaven, of bringing enrichment, of sparking mechanisms of subsidiarity. Universal fraternity and social friendship are thus two inseparable and equally vital poles in every society. To separate them would be to disfigure each and to create a dangerous polarization, end of quote. So the Pope later in 145 also recalls this image I have here on the screen of the polyhedron. He believes that there's two ways of thinking about this relationship between the global and the local. One is spherical, and if you look at my two soccer balls, one is spherical, in which the relationship between the center and the circumference is equidistant in all cases. That's homogenization. That's making everything uniform. The polyhedron, my other soccer ball, however, represents a diverse set of relationships between the global and the local. That's unity and diversity. So that's his image for understanding, I think it was a Japanese foreign minister who first coined the phrase, the global, and how Catholicity is always global. Now, we've heard some beautiful testimonies here today. Jackson Adamah talking about Mandela's Ubuntu, philosophy of reconciliation, Bishop Juan de Dios invoking Romero, Yuko Fukushima's memory of the Kakuri Christians, the hidden Christians who were destroyed in Nagasaki and who impel us to think about the end of all nuclear war. In the United States, I see a polarization, at least among my fellow Catholics. Some are drawn towards looking a blind eye towards this populist nationalism. Some on the other end of the spectrum, the more progressive side, ignore subsidiarity and turn a blind eye when kind of secular, universal global values don't take into account the local cultures. And this was very poignantly brought home to me. My last big conference, for what it's worth, was 2019 at the Baptist Seminary in Poland, where I heard about the importance of religious liberty in a Catholic Baptist dialogue for the Baptists in Poland, a seminary that was visited by no less than Billy Graham. So avoiding homogenization and enhancing the local while embracing the social friendship of fraternity. Let me end this reflection by offering a dream, not my dream, but the dream, because there's a fascination with dreaming in Pope Francis, but the dream that he invoked spontaneously on the porch of the old seminary in Havana during his visit to Cuba, and spontaneously talking to the Cuban youth and thinking about their dreams and their hopes. I mean, is it with the party or is it with the church? Both or neither. He invoked the image of the Guatemalan Nobel laureate, Miguel Ángel Asturias, from his book El Presidente. And he says to the youth, you need to have eyes of glass and eyes of flesh. Eyes of glass is the ideal, the transcendent, the hope for union with God. Eyes of flesh is what the Cubans call resolver, finding a way, making your own path, using common sense, but also witnessing to your faith in that very difficult situation where it's not easy to witness to your faith. There's no panacea, there's no recipe, there's no universal solution, but he's urging the Cuban youth to realize their dreams, to have fortitude, to draw upon their faith, to feel a sense of belonging in the church, even when it seems like God is dead, to have a sense of belonging in the church, and to use both their eyes of glass and their eyes of flesh. So I take that applies not just to Cuban youth. I take that also as a call for reform within the Catholic Church, a call for making things real. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Peter. Thank you. Jackson, I would like to continue with asking you to tell us a little bit about your reading of Pope Francis' discussion of fake Catholicity, I might not be pronounced it right, Catholicity versus true Catholicity. I think this will probably help us integrate some of the ideas that Wojciech and Peter have been presenting us. Please.
Thank you. Just picking up from where Professor Casarella left off, I see that I think the image of the polyhedron is very great, a very way to imagine the beautiful tension between the local and the global. And in fact, to be honest, when I started reading words like openness, a world without borders, initially I was scared like by that because of I've seen that kind of false Catholicity seen in economic globalization and how Africa's borders are so open to exploitation from the West. It's like, and so that fear was very much tangible as I was reading this, because false Catholicity seeks to homogenize and assimilate local political economies and culture into one dominant local paradigm. And I think Dr. Casarella's image of the sphere, the ball, does really give a wonderful, should I say, evoke a wonderful image of that. But Pope Francis critiqued this sense of false Catholicity in Frattelli Tutti, paragraph 100. And he says this: one model of globalization, in fact, consciously aims at a one-dimensional uniformity and seeks to eliminate all differences and traditions in a superficial quest for unity. If a certain kind of globalization claims to make everyone uniform, to level everyone out, that globalization destroys the rich gifts and uniqueness of each person and each people, end of quote. For instance, like from my perspective, Africa has seen the undercutting of its local political economies through economic globalization, which has imposed Western capitalist political economic models on Africa without due regard to the contextual differences. And this has contributed to Africa's current debt crisis and political instability. As we speak today, my country, Ghana, utilizes 77% of its GDP to service debt owed to Western capitalist corporations and nation states. What is worse, Africa has become a dumping ground for Western consumer goods. Indeed, 7 out of 10 consumer goods on sale in sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan African markets, are imported from countries outside the continent. So what that means is that our economy is becoming all the more dollarized, like every single day. And the local currency, you need so much of it to change into dollars. And so the irony is that, like, for a country that is one of the world's largest producers of cocoa, we've been #1 for some time. Many of the farmers have never even tasted chocolates before. And so because the cocoa is taken out of Ghana, processed in Western factories, and then sold back to us in a very, very, should I say, in a processed form, but which is very, very expensive, that the farmer who produces the cocoa cannot even buy that. And so the high cost of producing local consumer goods has generated high unemployment numbers. And to my mind, economic globalization is an example of a counterfeit Catholicity that does not promote the flourishing of local forms of life. And the encyclical encourages the sub-Saharan African church to resist false Catholicity imposed by Western capitalist regimes. And for me, this encyclical calls us to reimagine inclusive global and local political economic models and practices that promote flourishing for all. And so I would say that I will use this opportunity to reiterate the calls by African leaders of all, like many of even the nation state leaders and even the church have been calling for this, that we call on our Western brothers and sisters that we do not want aid, but fair trade. And that is the thing that I think the encounter that the encyclical calls for. One particular place that the encounter takes place is in trade, that we we trade as equal partners and not as people who, should I say, the unfair power dynamic that currently exists is what is creating the poverty in Africa. So yeah, we want fair trade and not aid. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. Like Dr. Szczerba was saying, truly optimistic vision, like a dream, a utopia, but an invitation for us to live and act in faith, not to live and act just in terms of human possibility, but really opening ourselves to the potential of the spirit acting, not only in very private, individual devotion, but in the structures of how we deal with others in our own communities and also across countries. Thank you, Jackson. I would like to invite Lucie to address one question that I have had in my mind as somebody that with her comes from the field of conflict transformation and peace building. Valerie is also part of this field of studies. Lucie, to us in the world of conflict transformation, peacemaking, peace building, there's always this question in the back of our minds, right? Stopping violence is priority number one, but we cannot be satisfied when armed violence, if I may say, ends, because we really need to find a way to build lasting peace. What would be your reflections in terms of what Pope Francis has written, in what words of hope you may want to give us today, as when we are not living in those contexts, some of us, maybe some of the members in our audience are, but in the context of the horrendous violence in Yemen as we speak, in Gaza, Israel, Palestine, in Somalia, in Colombia, and the list goes on and on. What signs of hope do you find in both the encyclical, but also in your practice?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for naming these places so that we carry them in our discussion today, those people also. I found chapter 7 of the encyclical very inspiring. It's called Path of Renewed Encounters. And the Pope says something that makes a distinction that can seem very simple, but to me very useful, between architecture of peace and the art of peace. So architecture would be like a field of expertise, economical, political, like we could put them institution building, state building, all these actions that try to bring peace and have failed also a lot of times. And I would like to connect this to what Jackson said about what kind of peace do we want to bring and with what power, so about the structures of power. And there is the architecture of peace and art of peace that involves all. So not only experts, but all. And the Pope calls for, in the encyclical, he says, lasting peace comes through processes of change. So processes means not like a quick fix or a one-moment solution, but processes of change that are launched by people and that do not come from ignoring social demands or quelling disturbances. So again, it's not a tranquilizing peace. It is processes of encounter. And this is connected to his idea, Pope Francis' idea that time is superior to space. So launching processes is more fruitful, even if it's very small at the beginning, and it seems not very efficient at the beginning. It's more powerful to bring a process of, for example, true dialogue, than finding a quick fix with it. Even though, as you said, stopping direct violence is important. And I think what's insightful in the encyclical is the Pope says, so you have to have these processes launched by people, this art of peace, but be careful who you're talking with. Inside a society, who are you including in these processes of dialogue, of change, of peace? are you including only like the elite or the people who are culturally, who master a type of language, a way of thinking, or the mainstream or the majority in the population? And what do you do with the poor? So of the disenfranchised, or the people who have a different culture inside your own nation. So he says, be very careful when you create those processes of dialogue. Who do they include, even inside a society? So you have to recognize, for example, the history of scorn or social exclusion of parts of the population. And you have to frame your peace-building initiatives, he says, in a cultural covenant that includes parts of the population that don't share your cultural references. And yeah, it's really culture. So I think it's very important to have this idea of making peace between, let's say, more traditional enemies requires architecture of peace, yes, but mainly art of peace, so the population themselves. But inside the population, be sure to have, as much as possible, everybody. And so, of course, this is again like a dream, a vision, clearly. But I think it's important that we make sure we don't work just only at one level, but we keep in mind that all those different dimensions in what we are doing, and also to make a sort of coordination of different peace-building initiatives so that we don't work against each other, but try to make as much as possible coordination. So I didn't intend to solve the problems of the conflict that you just shared, but I think this idea of processes of encounters can be a source of hope and a source of lasting commitment for peace also, because we don't hope to see the fruit immediately, even if it's very painful. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you so much. Well, I'm just panicking looking at the clock. I have a couple more questions I would like to, if you allow me, please, and then maybe we can go in a final round of very quick final reflections from each of you. But I would like to address Bishop Juan de Dios Peña. As you know, Bishop Juan de Dios is a peace leader in El Salvador, and I was thinking, Bishop, in the encyclical Frattelli Tutti, Pope Francis acknowledges the importance of recognizing the stories of people who have suffered violence and injustice, the importance of memory. And as a Peruvian, this is like a current struggle to affirm and recognize and honor the stories of the victims of the violent conflict in Peru. And I was wondering if you could please share your reflections about the importance, or if you don't happen to agree, that's fine, you just tell us what you think, about honoring the stories of survivors, and also what local churches in El Salvador either are doing or could be doing to honor the memory of survivors. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, as I said before, when Pope Francis was talking about all these realities, I say, this is exactly for my context, for my people, for El Salvador, because it is a big movement right now, especially on the younger people. You know, about 40% of the population of El Salvador is young people. And there is this big movement that is thinking on things are so bad in El Salvador that they need to be part of the past. We need to write a new chapter in the history. We don't have to be paying attention in the past anymore, because we need to continue our life and to build a different life. But this is very problematic for me, because we cannot ignore all the suffering and all the situations that people were living in El Salvador in the past, back in the 80s, even after the Civil War that lasts for 12 years. All this suffering, it was not only part of the history, but also it is part of something that allowed us to don't repeat the mistakes that we did, or the people in the past did. And Pope Francis spoke specifically to the youth. He put an example, saying that we have to see the life with historical conscience. I think those are the words that he says. Because if you don't have conscious about the history, then we can be condemned to be repeating things that are going to be very bad for the society and for our reality. As I say, in our context, we have very clear, defined by the Commission of the Truth of El Salvador, has been defined pretty well. Who did crime from the people on the left and the guerrillas, who did crime from the people in the right that were the army. But there is not much said about the victims, that they were not part of the conflict. And there's so many people, thousands of people murdered just for being in part of the community, just for living in places where the guerrillas used to walk. We cannot forget that. There are people that are claiming and they're crying out for justice. And justice sometimes doesn't mean to receive anything. It's just the fact to recognize that something really happens, because the government has been trying to hide what really happens. The system has been trying to hide what it happens. People just climb for that to be known by everybody, to be recognized, and to guarantee that this is not going to happen anymore. If we don't realize that something happens, it's very possible that can be repeated. So Pope Francis, it is telling us that it's very important to learn from the experience of the past and also of the older people as well. So I think that's very important, and especially for my context. So as we experience violence.
Thank you so much, Bishop Juan de Dios. El Salvador is a country that many of us at the Center for Reconciliation love deeply, and we look forward to serving with you as well as with all of our colleagues here on this panel and in the audience, in accompanying you, walking alongside you, and learning from you and with you in this path towards peace, justice, and reconciliation. We're going to start a final round of reflections from our panelists. I would like to first acknowledge some of the comments here on the chat. We will not have more time for questions in the chat, but I certainly would like to read this note from, let me read a couple here from tiny font. Oh, from Bentham. As Dr. Szczerba was describing the Catholic Church in Poland, he also seems to describe the white evangelical church in the United States, currently with its nationalistic tendencies. How do you faithfully love your enemy, the enemy who oppresses, especially as you recognize that the enemy is us in many ways? And Dr. Szczerba comments, yes, these questions are important. I, as a Latin American, can also witness to the love of God and recognize also this same problem in many countries, if not all countries in Latin America, by the way. Also from Ryan, our dear friend, Jackson, thank you so much for your insightful reading of African Nations, Open Borders, and an example of false Catholicity. Catholicity, I do have a problem with that word, false Catholicity. I am especially grateful for you drawing attention to Ghana as a dumping ground for trash, e-waste, medical waste, etc. from abroad. You've given us such a rich way to think about borders theologically, as we know they can participate so deeply in injustice, but as you suggested, they can potentially also be an aid to flourishing, especially if we can use a border to promote a movement from aid to fair trade, and I would add, and celebrate human dignity. So now for the final reflections, I would love to invite Dr. Fukushima. Yuko, you are a feminist Christian thinker in Japan, and I was wondering, what would be your final reflections from a feminist perspective?
Well, first, when I saw this book and saying Frattelli Tutti, So there is no word for sisters or the women's. And then the women's are always the poorest of the poorest. So when Pope Francis talks about the poor people, I'm always thinking about the poor women. And then the paragraph 188, it particularly saying about the marketing of the human organs and tissues, the sexual exploitation of boys and girls. And then when I read this sentence, I felt he really wants to stop these things happening in this world. And he's saying forgiveness is the only way for us to do so. And then we think, well, it is unrealistic. But I think for Christians, this is the only way to make real, to stopping these terrible things to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuko. From our theological reflection to be moved to action, to care for orthodoxy, but also for orthopraxis and stand up against violence. Thank you so much. Jackson, please, your final reflections.
So in terms of my final words, I want to sort of lift up a line in Professor Brederton's Christ and the Common Life. He has a beautiful chapter on humanity. And he said that encounter with and reception of strangers, if it is to be fruitful and respect the dignity of each, must attend to this threefold pattern of interpersonal and intracreational relationships. To welcome the other is to recognize one who is the same as me, that is using the common humanity frame. Yet to welcome the other is to be in a place of welcome, to be at home, and thus in a relationship with others who are more like me than the stranger welcomed, and thereby recognize that the stranger comes from a different form of life than me. However, to truly welcome another is to welcome someone who is like nobody else, affording them the attention and respect that communicates recognition of their uniqueness. And so we need to move in a spirit of Ubuntu, recognizing our uniqueness as individuals, and yet also our collective responsibility towards each other, the flourishing of all of us. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jackson. Wojciech, please.
Yeah, in the 1960s, there was a very difficult situation in Poland, especially between Poland and Germany after Second World War. Nobody knew whether what is going to be. Part of Poland was taken from Germany and given to Poland. There were hundreds and thousands of people who were expelled, and many of them died. Lots of tragedies, really. And then in the beginning of 60s, Polish bishops, they wrote a famous letter to Polish Catholic bishops, to German Lutheran bishops. And one of the main sentence was, we forgive and we ask for forgiveness. And this was beautiful, really. Our communist government hated this letter, but it was taken by German bishops and then by German government, by the Chancellor Willy Brandt. And he came to Poland. He asked for forgiveness. He would go to Auschwitz and to places like this. He would kneel down and he cried. And this was the beginning of real process of reconciliation. And it worked out. So today, when it is, it's 21st century, there is a deep friendship between Poland and Germany. And when I'm playing soccer with my son, I'm asking him, who do you want to be? He says, German player. For me, when I was a boy, it would be impossible, really impossible. but he wants to be a German player. So I'm thinking miracles happen, and it's wonderful really to dream. And that's true. When we dream together, miracles happen. And I think that this Frattelli Tutti encyclical is about dreams that are really happening. And I think it is really worth going this direction.
In that spirit of Ubuntu that Jackson has been teaching us, permeate every country, every community, every home. I would like to invite next Lucie for her final reflections, please.
Thank you very much. In this encyclical, the Pope acknowledges that the vision he shares can be seen as illusion by somebody who doesn't attempt to change their way of thinking, what they believe is true. And this was the case also for the encyclical Laudato Si on the care for our common home. So what story do you believe? What is true about the world? Like, is business as usual more realistic? And should you believe that in order not to be taken as a naive person? Or can you share those dreams and then you could be a 10-year-old, not a grown-up? So I think that perspectives are changing, and I think it's worth taking the risk to share that vision. And I think it may be more realistic actually to think that all people, to begin by thinking that all people are my brothers and sisters, that hospitality is the key to a healthy national identity, and that migrants are people before being a political issue to solve. And I say this as a French person whose country is struggling with this issue and whose borders are closing. And yeah, I do think that it's more realistic to think as Frattelli Tutti than to think to try to do good, rational politics that will not lead us to life.
Merci. Bishop Juan de Dios.
Yes, well, for me, Frattelli Tutti is a sign of hope for all nations, and also invite us, to each one of us, to be responsibles, or maybe also co-responsibles in creating a society that is able to include people, to integrate and lift up all those who have fallen and are suffering. Recently, on May 11th, we, in our school, in the Methodist school, we're coming back to presential classes. And something that we noticed is that our students, they don't have the same skills of relate to each other. And it's so strange because we expect that they can be friendly with each other, but they are not. So they are just learning again to be friends and to love to one each other. And I really believe that we are called to do that because we're made for love. We have been made by God for love. And also, we as Christians have to recognize that every person has dignity, and we have to include and not exclude to anybody.
Gracias, Obispo. Dr. Casarella, please.
Since we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic and going back to work, or at least dreaming about going back to work, I'd like to say a word about Pope Francis on work and the worker. He, of course, in the encyclical supports the idea that there's a dignity of work in the eyes of God, an eminent dignity of every worker. He also cites what was already noted by Wojciech, the Laborem Exercens, saying that the common use of created goods is the first principle of the ethical and social order. But in the book that he co-authored with Austin Ivory called Let Us Dream, which is very important, I think, for interpreting Frattelli, he comes back to this question and asks how fraternity can be built into the workplace, both on the micro and the macro level. And he makes an interesting etymological point about the words company and corporation. Company has within it pan, and it's the sharing of bread together. And corporation, cuerpo, is the integration into the larger body. So how can we hopefully, slowly, safely go back to work, but also thinking on the micro and the macro level about structures in the post-pandemic economy that will promote the sharing of bread together and the integration into the larger body. Basically, Pope Francis doesn't want to vilify private enterprise. He wants to lift it up, but on the condition that it's in the service of the common good. And that's, I think, one of his most important prophetic utterances and might help us get us through what we're going through now.
Thank you so much, Peter. We've talked about dreaming, illusions, utopias, visions of what in human strength we may just be honest, let's be honest, is impossible. But we are here because there is a faith that unites us. And we are not trusting our own strength, but the incredible power of the Ruah of God, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Ubuntu in every person, in every community, in every country. So in that same faith, I would not describe it as the illusion, but actually the very certain future that awaits us of all nations, all tribes, all peoples, coming before the throne of mercy of our God to praise him together. I would like for all of us to join in a word of prayer with the words of our Lord Jesus of Nazareth. And I invite you to pray in the language of your heart, but this is the Lord's Prayer, and we are going to participate listening it first in Japanese, immediately in Polish, after that in Francais, and then we will finish in Espanol. Yuko, please lead us in prayer.
天に増します我らの父よ、願わくは皆をあがめさせたまえ、御国をきたらせたまえ、御心の天になるごとく地にもなさせたまえ、我らの日曜の糧を与える、我らの罪を許すごとく我らの罪をも許したまえ、我らを試みに合わせず悪より救い出したまえ、国と力と栄とは限りなく汝のものなればなり。アーメン。
Ojcze nasz, który jesteś w niebie, święć się imię Twoje, przyjdź królestwo Twoje. Bądź wola Twoja, jako w niebie, tak i na ziemi. Chleba naszego powszedniego daj nam dzisiaj i odpuść nam nasze winy, jako i my odpuszczamy naszym winowajcom. I nie wódź nas na pokuszenie, ale nas zbaw ode złego. Amen.
Notre Père qui es aux cieux, que ton nom soit sanctifié, que ton règne vienne, que ta volonté soit faite sur la terre comme au ciel. Donne-nous aujourd'hui notre pain de ce jour. Pardonne-nous nos offenses, comme nous pardonnons aussi à ceux qui nous ont offensés. Et ne nous laisse pas entrer en tentation, mais délivre-nous du mal. Amen.
Padre nuestro que estás en los cielos, santificado sea tu nombre. Venga a nosotros tu reino. Hágase tu voluntad, en la tierra como en el cielo. Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día. Perdona nuestras ofensas como también nosotros perdonamos a quienes nos ofenden. Y no nos dejes caer en tentación y líbranos del mal. Amén.
Amén. Amén.